Hey guys, tonight we ease into a dim hallway lined with peeling red banners, the kind that hang a little unevenly, as if even the fabric isn't sure what the future holds. You step quietly, because everyone in this world feels like they're whispering, even when they're shouting slogans. Lenin is gone, the father of the revolution, the man whose face is already being carved into marble, has slipped from the world in 1924, and you find yourself in that strange pause where people still speak his name with reverence, but are already wondering who gets his desk. It's the kind of moment where you probably won't survive this if you say the wrong thing. Though to be fair, in Soviet politics, saying anything might get you in trouble.
So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, let me know your location and local time in the comments, because somewhere out there, someone is drifting into sleep hearing about political intrigue. And honestly, there are worse lullabies. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move deeper into the corridors of the early Soviet state, where the air smells faintly of ink, cold iron, and a lingering hope that the revolution might still work if only someone can steer it. But control is suddenly a question without an answer. Everyone around you is pretending they know what Lenin wanted. The funny thing is, Lenin left no clear succession plan, just a trail of letters, warnings, and half-remembered instructions that party members now quote like bedtime stories to justify whatever they're already planning to do. A mainstream fact floats above the chaos. Lenin died in January 1924 after a series of strokes, leaving behind a power vacuum no one was prepared for. The Politburo, ideally a collective leadership, immediately becomes a chessboard where everyone insists they hate chess, even as they shove pawns forward. You sense the tension most strongly between two figures: Leon Trotsky, the fiery orator with wire-rimmed glasses and a permanent sense that everyone else is doing the revolution incorrectly, and Joseph Stalin, the quieter, shorter, steel-eyed organizer who has spent years making himself unavoidable. You see Stalin sitting at his desk, signing off on bureaucratic memos that look boring until you realize they determine who gets promoted, who gets transferred, and who suddenly finds their office moved 3 floors down next to the boiler room. He's like the coworker who brings donuts but somehow ends up in charge of the company. You hear people debate Trotsky's brilliance. He led the Red Army after all. He helped win the Civil War. But he's also aloof, intellectual, prone to monologues. One party member jokes, softly, checking over his shoulder, that Trotsky could give a speech about a broken teacup and somehow turn it into a warning about the Thermidorian reaction. It's a joke, but you note how people laugh nervously, because joking about big names is the political equivalent of juggling chainsaws. Historians still argue whether Trotsky ever genuinely had a chance to succeed Lenin, or if Stalin's web of alliances had already closed the door. Some say Trotsky lacked the ruthlessness needed to navigate what the revolution had become. Others say he lacked the social skills. Basically, he was the smartest kid in class but never figured out how to sit at the popular table. A quirky tidbit slips into your ear. Stalin wasn't even on many people's radar as a successor at first. His role as general secretary was considered administrative, almost dull. One early party critic dismissed the job as shuffling papers. Joke's on him. Stalin was shuffling people, and that's a much more effective path to power. As you wander the party meetings of 1924, you notice how people watch each other more than they listen. Every speech is a performance. Every applause is suspiciously long. When someone says, "comrade," it's impossible to tell if they mean friend or future threat. You catch Trotsky delivering a razor-sharp argument about bureaucracy choking the revolution, but the audience shifts uncomfortably. Not because he's wrong, many think he's right, but because Stalin is sitting 3 rows back, expression unreadable, tapping a pencil like a metronome of quiet warning. You step into another room, where Stalin is speaking, or rather, not speaking too much. His gift at this stage isn't blazing rhetoric, it's endurance. He outsits, outwaits, and outorganizes.
Meetings stretch long, and Stalin stays calm, taking notes, smiling politely, offering small, helpful suggestions that somehow always give him just a bit more influence. He's the guy who volunteers to manage the mailing lists and ends up controlling the entire membership roster. By mid-1924, you sense something like gravity pulling towards Stalin. It's light at first, barely noticeable, but with each passing month, more figures drift into his orbit. Old Bolsheviks who once scoffed at him now stop by his office with questions, favors, subtle alliances. You can almost hear the political tectonic plates shifting under your feet. As you stroll through smoky backrooms and late-night committee debates, you notice that Trotsky's circle is shrinking. He's admired, yes, but admiration doesn't translate into votes or influence or the ability to assign people to new posts. Stalin, meanwhile, controls the levers of bureaucracy like a master pianist playing quietly in the dark. Another mainstream historical fact emerges. By the end of 1924, Stalin has positioned himself as the defender of Leninism, accusing opponents of factionalism, one of the worst political sins in the party, and he does it with an ever-growing loyal base, carefully cultivated through years of appointments and deals. Still, the story isn't finished. Trotsky delivers brilliant speeches, writes powerful essays, and occasionally dominates a room with sheer presence. You feel the hope flicker. Maybe he can reverse the tide, but the tide doesn't reverse. It rarely does in history when it's already halfway across the room. By 1925, you watch Trotsky being nudged aside from his Red Army leadership. By 1926, you see him forming alliances with Zinoviev and Kamenev, former rivals now desperate to slow Stalin's ascent. It's a shaky coalition, like three cats agreeing not to fight while sitting on a single, shrinking couch. And Stalin? He dismantles the coalition piece by piece, exiling Trotsky's supporters, promoting loyalists, reshaping the party narrative so smoothly that many members think they've believed it all along. A final quirky detail drifts your way. Stalin had a habit of remembering tiny slights for years. Someone who once spoke over him in a meeting. Someone who forgot to send him documents on time. These people didn't always suffer immediately, but their names were quietly logged in the back of his mind, like seeds waiting for spring. By 1927, Trotsky is expelled from the Politburo. By 1928, he's exiled internally. By 1929, he's expelled from the Soviet Union entirely. His journey taking him from Alma-Ata to Turkey, then farther. You stand alone in a quiet Moscow hallway. Again, the corridor feels colder now, as if the air finally understands that a new order has arrived. Stalin's shadow stretches long across the floor. You keep walking through those dim Soviet corridors and the political air grows heavier, like fog thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken worries. Even though Trotsky has already felt the sting of political isolation, you're still standing in the mid-1920s, right in the middle of the duel between him and Stalin. A duel fought not with pistols at dawn, but with speeches, alliances, edits to party minutes, and the kind of bureaucratic maneuvers that feel sleepy until you realize they decide who lives near the Kremlin and who gets reassigned to a dusty office in Omsk. You drift beside the men in this struggle, watching them circle each other like two chess masters who hate each other but pretend to be cordial for the sake of the crowd. Trotsky is the dazzling figure in this dance, the one whose speeches make people sit up straight. He practically glows when he talks, waving one hand, adjusting his glasses, summarizing Marxist theory at a pace that makes even you feel like you should have brought a notepad. The mainstream historical fact lands with clarity. Trotsky had been the architect of the Red Army during the Civil War, a role that gave him enormous prestige. People whispered, in admiration and fear, that he was the only man in the Soviet Union who could make trains run on time and armies move in sync. You sense that charisma pulsing off him, like a lantern in a hallway full of flickering bulbs. But charisma is a double-edged sword.
As you stand close, you hear some party members mutter that Trotsky is too brilliant, too sure of himself, too willing to correct others with that, "actually, comrade," tone that makes even allies feel like slow students. One quirk slips in from behind a curtain. Trotsky reportedly loved writing so much that he once drafted political essays while lying in bed wearing only a robe and slippers, dictating paragraphs at a speed that made his stenographers scribble like they were under gunfire. The revolution for him was also a literary project. Stalin, meanwhile, sits in quieter corners. He doesn't dominate the room the moment he enters. He doesn't sparkle. He doesn't thunder. Instead, he studies everyone, nodding with that small, unreadable smile. The kind of smile you see on someone who already knows the ending of the movie you're watching for the first time. He doesn't interrupt when others speak. He simply waits, like a patient fisherman, letting currents drift people closer until they're already in his net. And the net, disguised as administrative efficiency, keeps widening. Historians still argue whether Stalin always intended to eliminate Trotsky, or if he simply evolved into that position as political opportunities presented themselves. Some say rivalry was inevitable between two revolutionary titans. Others believe Trotsky's temperament made him incapable of building the kind of support base Stalin was already perfecting. You drift through these debates like you're overhearing arguments across a library table. At one Central Committee meeting, you stand behind the rows of chairs, feeling the tension twist like a wire. Trotsky gives a forceful speech criticizing growing bureaucracy, saying the revolution is becoming bogged down in paper and procedures. His voice rises, the words Thermidorian danger float across the room. But something is off. People avoid his gaze. A few scribble in notebooks, not because they're taking notes, but because it gives their eyes something else to do. Stalin, sitting in the second row, doesn't flinch. He just taps his pencil once against his notepad and waits for Trotsky to run out of breath. When Stalin speaks, it's brief and controlled. He gently accuses Trotsky of factionalism. The word rolls across the room like a cold breeze. Factionalism, organizing against party unity, is political arsenic. You watch several members stiffen, trying not to look like they agree with anyone too strongly. It's like a sleepover game of don't get chosen first, except the stakes are exile and disgrace instead of losing your pillow. You step into late-night arguments among the united opposition, the uneasy alliance Trotsky forms with Zinoviev and Kamenev. They talk intensely, pacing around a cluttered apartment, voices rising not in anger, but desperation. Here's the mainstream fact. This coalition was real, formed in 1926 to challenge Stalin's growing power. But the quirky tidbit hiding under the table is that these three had spent earlier years attacking each other in speeches, letters, and newspapers. Now they're trying to stitch together a united front from the tatters of old insults. One historian dryly noted that the coalition looked like three men who decided to put out a fire by arguing about who misplaced the bucket. As you peer through the wallpaper-thin walls of the party headquarters, you sense Stalin tightening his grip. He promotes loyalists from obscure provinces, quietly demotes potential Trotskyites, and paints himself as the guardian of Lenin's legacy. By claiming to embody Leninism, he gains a moral high ground that Trotsky, surprisingly, struggles to counter. Historians still argue whether Stalin genuinely believed in this identity or if it was purely strategic. But either way, it works. At one Politburo session, you notice something subtle but decisive. Trotsky sits alone at one end of the table, while Stalin is flanked by supporters. It doesn't matter what's said. The body language tells the truth. Power isn't just about arguments. It's about chairs, clusters, who walks in with whom, who whispers to whom during breaks. You're watching the invisible markers of dominance snap into place. The purge hasn't begun yet, but you feel the premonition of it in small gestures. A secretary who once worked closely with Trotsky now nods more enthusiastically when Stalin enters the room. A minor functionary starts dropping Trotsky's name less often. Then, not at all. People talk about the line of the party, as if it were a living thing that could turn and bite anyone who failed to follow. By 1927, Trotsky is isolated. Stalin has labeled him an enemy of unity, and suddenly everyone finds reasons to avoid his office. You stand by the window as Trotsky pens a final protest against the direction of the Soviet state. The quirky detail here? Trotsky, even when packing for exile, kept correcting people's grammar. Some habits are harder to purge than others. You walk beside him as he's escorted out of the Kremlin, past soldiers who aren't sure whether to salute him or pretend they don't recognize him. Snow gathers quietly around his boots. He looks over his shoulder once, not in fear, but in disbelief at how quickly a revolution can turn on its brightest minds. Stalin, watching from an upper window, doesn't smile. He simply notes the moment and turns back to his paperwork, adding another memo to the endless stack that helps him solidify the world he's shaping. You sense it. A duel fought without swords, but with consequences sharper than steel. You drift forward without pausing, stepping right into the late 1920s. Those months when the floorboards of Soviet politics start tilting unmistakably toward one man. The duel is over, even if the echoes linger. Trotsky is gone from Moscow, and you can feel the shift in the atmosphere. Conversations in hallways become shorter. People lower their voices only out of habit now, because the real danger isn't who might overhear them. It's that everyone already knows which way the wind is blowing, and it's blowing steadily, firmly, towards Stalin. By 1929, the mainstream historical fact is undeniable. Joseph Stalin has effectively secured dominance over the Communist Party and the Soviet government. No more alliances of convenience, no more committees where opinions feel evenly balanced. Stalin sits firmly in the center, and every political current flows either toward him or straight into oblivion. You sense it in the rhythm of meetings, how people lean slightly forward when he speaks, how they nod a fraction too quickly, how even the silence after his jokes feels tense, as if everyone is trying to decide whether laughing is safe tonight. You wander into a smoky Politburo session where Stalin is reviewing plans for the first 5-year plan. His tone is brisk, almost clipped, but the authority underneath is unmistakable. He no longer needs to persuade. He informs, and others respond with a mix of agreement and something almost like awe, though maybe fear-tinged respect is more accurate. You catch a whisper from one official to another, something like, "He remembers everything, you know." And the man saying it doesn't sound accusatory. It sounds admiring, like he's describing a predatory bird with impressive wingspan. Stalin's bureaucratic power by this point is almost supernatural. As General Secretary, he has spent years managing party appointments, internal records, and personnel files. The quirky tidbit here is almost comical. He often read personnel reports late into the night, making little marks in the margins, tiny symbols only he fully understood. Some historians joke he had a secret codebook for people's loyalty levels, preferences, and weaknesses. Whether that's true or not, you sense the obsessive attention he gives to the machinery of state. He isn't flashy, but he knows precisely which gears to tighten, which to oil, and which to remove altogether. Now that Trotsky is exiled in Turkey, the opposition collapses like a paper facade. People who once murmured Trotsky's slogans now quote Stalin with fervor. Not because they've suddenly converted, but because survival depends on enthusiasm, not neutrality. The Communist Party claims to be eliminating factionalism, but you watch as a new faction forms, one wearing Stalin's quiet smile, one stepping eagerly into his shadow. Historians still argue whether Stalin's dominance by 1929 was the result of remarkable political skill or a perfect storm of his opponent's missteps. Some say Zinoviev and Kamenev underestimated him. Others say Trotsky was doomed by temperament.
Still others claim the system itself was designed to reward whoever controlled the administrative core, and Stalin just understood that better than anyone. You listen to these debates echo through scholarly books like wind through narrow alleys. But standing here, in this moment, the reason feels simple. Stalin wanted power more steadily, more patiently, and more relentlessly than anyone else. You slip into an office where a group of mid-level party members are hunched over papers, drafting resolutions praising Stalin's ideological clarity. Their words feel formulaic, yet the anxiety behind them is real. One man hesitates over a sentence, wondering if calling Stalin the true continuer of Lenin's legacy is sufficiently emphatic or dangerously overblown. You watch him edit it 3 times before finally deciding to keep it, the political equivalent of choosing which wire to cut in a bomb defusal scene. By the early months of 1929, Stalin has not just defeated the left opposition, but also brought the right opposition, Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky, to heel. You see Bukharin, the darling of the party, sitting alone in a quiet room, rubbing his forehead as he contemplates a future shrinking around him. It's not a purge yet. That comes later, darker and sharper, but the groundwork is unmistakable. Bukharin once described Stalin as a great political figure, but a devil. The line lands in your ear like a whisper at the edge of a dream, both admiring and terrified. A quirky tidbit? Bukharin also loved drawing little caricatures of political colleagues in the margins of his notes. You imagine one of Stalin, maybe with exaggerated mustaches, and you hope he burned those sketches before anyone found them. You drift next into a factory hall, where workers applaud announcements of rapid industrialization. Loudspeakers crackle with promises. Steel, tractors, hydroelectric power. It feels upbeat, ambitious, even hopeful. Yet beneath it, the ground trembles with the unspoken knowledge that failure is no longer acceptable. When Stalin says the Soviet Union must catch up with the advanced countries in 10 years or be crushed, the audience hears both the urgency and the threat. It's a declaration of purpose and a warning. One official murmurs to a colleague that he hasn't slept properly in weeks. Another jokes, half-heartedly, that in the new Soviet Union, insomnia is a patriotic duty. You give a soft, sleepy laugh at that one. It's funny in the bleak Soviet way, like joking about the weather while standing in a blizzard. You sense the moment Stalin's dominance finally cements itself. It happens not in a dramatic speech, but in a small, mundane gesture. A woman in the Central Committee spills a stack of papers, and several men immediately bend to help, until they notice Stalin approaching. Suddenly, they stand straight as rulers. Stalin kneels down himself, casually picking up a few sheets, and murmurs something short and polite. The others freeze, not sure whether to join him or step away. Power is like that. It's not always in the outbursts. Sometimes it's in the silence, in the subtle signals, in the way people hesitate. By the end of 1929, you find yourself walking past Stalin in a hallway. He moves with a quiet confidence now, someone who no longer fears opposition because he has already dismantled it. Not with mass arrests, not yet, but with organization, alliances, patience, and relentless administrative control. He has won the revolution inside the revolution. You glance back once. The door closes behind him, and history stands on the threshold of something darker. You keep walking without pausing, and suddenly, the polished corridors of Moscow give way to dirt roads, cold wind, and the wide, uneasy silence of the Soviet countryside. It's the early 1930s now, and even though Stalin has secured political dominance, he isn't content with ruling the party. He wants to remake the entire nation. You feel it in the brittle air around you. This isn't just administration anymore. It's transformation at a scale that bends the lives of millions. And you're right in the middle of it, walking between barns, overturned carts, and anxious villagers who have no idea how violently their world is about to change. The mainstream fact lands immediately. Forced collectivization of agriculture begins in 1929 to 1930.
and it overturned centuries of farming life across the USSR. The idea in theory is simple. Merge private farms into massive collective farms, pool labor, modernize tractors, and produce grain in abundance. But as you watch the bewildered faces around you, you feel how the theory evaporates the moment it touches the ground. These people have been farming family plots for generations. The land is more than soil. It's memory, identity, survival. And now, someone from Moscow is telling them to give it all up. You watch a party official arrive at a village assembly with a clipboard and a stiff smile that tries to look friendly, but ends up looking like he's smelling something unpleasant. He reads from a prepared text about the glorious collective path forward, and the peasants stare at him the way you might stare at someone explaining that starting next week, all shoes will be communal property. One old man whispers, "They want us to farm like a factory," and you can hear the confusion in his voice, not the defiance. These people aren't resisting because they're stubborn. They're resisting because the world they know is being rewritten faster than they can process. A quirky tidbit slips in here. Some early collectivization propaganda actually showed smiling peasants leaning on tractors that didn't exist yet. The artists were instructed to draw modern equipment even before it was delivered, hoping enthusiasm would manifest the machines like some kind of socialist wish fulfillment spell. Spoiler, it didn't work. As you walk between fields, you notice livestock penned behind fences. The last private animals many families still hold on to, but not for long. Officials list households as kulaks, a term meaning wealthy peasants, except the definition is expanding by the minute. Wealth, in this context, becomes a matter of owning 2 cows instead of 1, or hiring a farmhand for a single season. Even wearing a slightly nicer coat begins to look suspicious. Historians still argue whether Stalin intended the category to be so broad, or whether local officials inflated numbers to meet quotas and impress superiors. Either way, entire families suddenly find themselves labeled as class enemies. You stand in a barn where a family is hurriedly packing a small bundle, just a few pieces of clothing, a photo of grandparents, a spoon, a blanket. They've been told they must relocate to special settlements in Siberia. The mother tries to stay calm, humming a tune as she ties the bundle, but her hands shake. One of the children keeps asking whether they'll come back in time for spring planting. No one answers. Outside, neighbors look away, afraid to be seen helping. One man forces a smile and says, "Things will improve soon." It isn't encouragement, it's survival instinct. The collectivization campaign marches on, and the countryside begins to warp under the strain. Barns are emptied, livestock slaughtered rather than surrendered, grain seized for state procurement, even when stores run dangerously low. You walk through a village that feels hollowed out, doors hanging open, smoke no longer rising from chimneys. A woman stands outside a half-empty granary and mutters, "Even the mice have gone hungry." And then, the famine arrives. The mainstream fact is chilling. Collectivization contributes to one of the worst famines in Soviet history, especially severe in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and parts of Russia and the North Caucasus. Millions perish, grain production collapses, livestock numbers plunge, and entire communities are broken. You feel the famine like a cold hand tightening around your chest. Villagers scrape the bark from trees, boil leather shoes, grind acorns and weeds into something that resembles flour but tastes like bitterness. A quirky detail emerges, a bitter echo of desperation. In some regions, families tried to ferment anything they could salvage into alcohol, not to drink, but to trade, because vodka sometimes traveled farther in the black market than bread. It's a strange, tragic irony, turning scraps into currency for survival. The state's response, meanwhile, becomes increasingly paranoid. Stalin and his circle view the chaos not as a failure of policy, but as evidence of sabotage. You can feel that paranoia seeping into every report, every accusation. Wreckers, counter-revolutionaries, class enemies. The vocabulary grows harsher. Historians still argue whether Stalin genuinely believed conspiracies were everywhere, or whether he used them as justification to tighten control. The truth probably sits somewhere in the shadowy border between fear and opportunity. You're back in Moscow now, drifting into a dimly lit office where Stalin reads famine reports with a stony, unreadable expression. He circles phrases with red pencil, underlining mentions of resistance and deliberate grain shortfalls. As he writes in the margins, you see the logic of the coming purge forming like storm clouds. If you sense how deeply the famine scars the political elite, rumors of rebellion in the countryside spread like a second plague. Officials whisper that hungry peasants might rise up, that the military might waver, that hidden networks of former kulaks might be plotting revolt. None of this is entirely true, but none of it is entirely false either. In that fog of uncertainty, fear becomes a kind of fuel. You walk outside into a Moscow street where posters show smiling farmers holding bountiful harvests that don't exist. The disconnect between propaganda and reality is almost surreal. People gather around a notice board, reading upbeat agricultural statistics that everyone knows are exaggerated. Yet, they read them anyway, because that's what one does now. Participate. Somewhere behind you, a man jokes under his breath that the collective farms are like communal marriage. Everybody shares everything, and no one is happy. You hear someone hiss at him to be quiet, but the joke lingers, a tiny act of rebellion swallowed by the wind. And through all this, you feel Stalin's gaze widening, scanning the entire country for threats. Collectivization wasn't just an economic policy. It becomes a catalyst for suspicion, a reason to believe that enemies lurk everywhere. From hungry peasants to party intellectuals, the system creaks under pressure. And in that creaking, you can already hear the first groans of the purge to come. You stand on a hill overlooking a village with too many empty homes and too few voices. A cold breeze cuts through your coat. The countryside is changing, and so is the state. One broken harvest becomes a justification for a political storm, and you feel that storm approaching. You step forward without a break, and suddenly the countryside dissolves into a haze of dust and papers as you re-enter Moscow. Only now the city feels different, as if its walls have absorbed the tension radiating from the villages. Forced collectivization has cracked the foundations of the Soviet Union, and the tremors are spreading upward into the highest levels of power. You feel it immediately. Paranoia isn't just in the air, it's the air. Thick, suffocating, humming like an electric current. Every conversation in a hallway seems shorter. Every doorway glances back at you, and every face holds that tightness around the eyes, as though everyone has learned to smile and worry at the same time. This is the early to mid-1930s, and Stalin's circle is now reacting to instability like a doctor diagnosing symptoms that must be cut out aggressively. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Collectivization's chaos, the famine, the resistance, the drop in grain, the peasant uprisings, convinced Stalin and the political elite that some kind of rebellion could erupt. If peasants could resist collectivization, maybe party members could resist industrialization. If villages could hide grain, maybe generals could hide conspiracies. You feel that logic seeping through reports, memos, conversations. The fear becomes a lens through which everything looks dangerous. You walk into an office where a nervous local official from Ukraine is giving a report on sabotage in agriculture. His hands shake slightly as he reads it aloud. You notice how he uses the word sabotage 7 times, even when describing weather problems. The quirky tidbit here? Soviet officials sometimes blamed poor harvests on counter-revolutionary clouds, as though the sky itself had joined an anti-Soviet plot. You hear a colleague snort softly at that phrase, then quickly cover it with a cough. As you hover near the doorway, Stalin listens without blinking, gently tapping a pencil against his desk, a steady rhythm that somehow feels more ominous than shouting. He doesn't accuse anyone directly. Instead, he asks questions. Simple, calm, devastating questions.
Why did yields fall here but not there? Who is responsible for procurement in this district? Which individuals opposed collectivization? Each question is a spotlight, and officials scramble to drag someone else into the beam. Historians still argue whether Stalin's paranoia was genuine or deliberately cultivated. Some believe he truly feared internal collapse and saw enemies everywhere. Others argue he used fear strategically to consolidate power, punishing those who had once opposed him and intimidating everyone else into obedience. Standing in this moment, the line between genuine fear and useful fear is too blurred to see clearly. Whatever Stalin believed, the effect is the same. Suspicion becomes policy. You drift through a corridor lined with propaganda posters, strong peasants, smiling children, heroic tractor drivers. They present a world of confidence and abundance. But on a bench below these posters, two mid-level officials whisper urgently. You hear one mutter that the OGPU, soon to be transformed into the NKVD, has increased surveillance on people near military factories. The other whispers about engineers accused of sabotage because a single machine part failed. Neither man looks up at the posters above them. Those images belong to another universe. Across the country, rumors spiral wildly. You hear someone insist that former kulaks are plotting coordinated attacks on grain reserves. Someone else claims foreign spies have infiltrated rural party committees. And yet another whispers that the famine wasn't an accident, but a foreign plot designed to weaken the USSR before an invasion. It's like walking through a building where every room echoes a different ghost story. You step into a smoky cafeteria where engineers huddle over diluted tea. One mentions that a turbine failed at a power station. Immediately, another man leans closer and says, "Don't report it yet. They'll call it treason." Everyone nods. You realize how broken the system has become. Fear of punishment has replaced the ability to solve problems. A quirky observation someone makes quietly. In the Soviet Union, even gravity is a counter-revolutionary force if something falls at the wrong time. You give a soft laugh, but it catches in your throat. Jokes here feel like balancing acts. Meanwhile, Stalin receives regular reports on international threats. Germany is rearming. Japan is expanding in Asia. Poland, Romania, Finland. All are seen as possible staging grounds for capitalist aggression. Historians still argue whether Stalin interpreted these threats realistically or exaggerated them to justify internal control. Either way, the combination of external tension and internal disaster creates a perfect storm of anxiety. You drift into a dimly lit meeting room where senior party members discuss the mood of the masses. One says peasants are whispering that collectivization is a curse. Another insists sabotage is growing in cities. The words "class enemy" appear in the discussion like sparks off steel. You notice one man nervously tugging at his collar as Stalin's name is mentioned. He looks like someone already rehearsing his future confession. And it isn't just peasants and workers who fall under suspicion. You step upstairs into the intellectual halls. Universities, cultural committees, scientific institutes. Suddenly, professors are suspect. Writers are suspect. Linguists, economists, historians. Anyone who thinks independently becomes a potential threat because thinking too deeply might reveal the cracks in the system. You pass a lecturer removing books from a shelf, not because they're banned yet, but because he can feel the wind changing. There's a chilling logic forming here, and you see it everywhere. If the state is failing in any way, someone must be responsible, and that someone must be an enemy. It's a worldview that spares no one. Stalin applies it relentlessly. If peasants resist, enemy. If engineers report failures, enemy. If intellectuals hesitate, enemy. If party members disagree, enemy. You catch a glimpse of a Politburo member reading a report on anti-Soviet agitation in the countryside. His face is pale, and you can see the fear behind his eyes. He doesn't wonder whether the accusations are true. He wonders whether he might be next. You drift into the streets of Moscow at dusk. Snow begins to fall softly, muffling the city in a strange quiet. People walk quickly, eyes down, collars up, as though listening for footsteps behind them. A woman pulls her shawl tighter and murmurs to her friend, "They're looking everywhere now." Her voice trembles. Above you, the lights of the Kremlin glow faintly through the snow. The glow feels watchful, and you feel the shift settling in. Paranoia is no longer a reaction. It's becoming the framework of the state. Something much darker is about to hatch from it. You move forward into the thickening fog of the early mid-1930s, and the shape of the Soviet state feels different now, heavier, like a building whose foundation has shifted, but whose walls stay standing out of sheer force of will. The paranoia that settled in the last section isn't drifting anymore. It's hardening. You can feel it every time someone glances over their shoulder, every time a pen pauses above a notepad, every time a whispered conversation stops the moment a door creaks open. Stalin's worldview has crystallized. Any person, any group, any idea that could conceivably support rebellion must be crushed before it ever breathes. You walk into a meeting room where party officials sit stiffly as Stalin outlines this logic, not in fiery speeches, but in calm statements that drop like stones into still water. "We cannot wait for threats to organize," he says. "We must remove the conditions for threats." The mainstream historical fact sits right there in those words. Stalin began targeting not just actual opponents, but potential opponents, peasants, engineers, intellectuals, regional leaders, religious figures, even longtime party loyalists. Suspicion had become infrastructure. As you drift through corridors and hearing rooms, you see how widely the net is cast. A peasant who once hired a farmhand gets labeled a former kulak. A teacher who uses pre-revolutionary textbooks is accused of spreading outdated ideology. A factory manager whose machines break down too often becomes someone intentionally undermining socialist productivity. You overhear one official muttering that, "If a nail bends, an enemy must have hammered it." And another responds, "Don't joke, someone might write that down." A quirky tidbit floats into your ear, almost absurd if it weren't happening in such a grim atmosphere. In some offices, people began using pencils instead of pens when signing documents because they feared someone might alter their signature to incriminate them. Imagine living in a place where even your handwriting feels like a liability. You drift to a provincial committee meeting where a nervous local leader reads a report about counter-revolutionary agitation. His voice cracks on the phrase. You can see why. In the new logic of the state, failing to find enemies is itself suspicious. If your district has no subversives, someone might conclude you're protecting them. Historians still argue whether Stalin consciously encouraged this culture of preemptive accusation or whether it emerged from below, local officials desperate to demonstrate vigilance. Either way, the outcome is the same. Every level of society begins feeding the machine of fear. Walk into a schoolyard for a moment. Children in heavy coats practice marching, chanting slogans about vigilance and unity. One girl points at a broken swing and whispers to her friend that maybe wreckers broke it. The other nods solemnly. You feel a chill at how effectively the state has taught even the youngest citizens to see enemies in ordinary inconveniences. Childhood, here, has been militarized. You wander next to a modest apartment kitchen where two parents sit across from one another in silence as their teenager reads a pamphlet assigned by the young pioneers about exposing hidden threats. The parents meet eyes briefly, each terrified that their child might misunderstand a joke, a sigh, a stray comment, and report it. The walls feel thinner, the air feels sharper. You can almost hear the sound of trust cracking. In the cities, the pressure grows stronger. You step into a factory meeting where a worker is being criticized for lax discipline. His real offense? He asked why the new production targets were impossible. Someone interpreted his question as sabotage. You watch him force a smile, nodding along as co-workers denounce him. You notice how he keeps his gaze fixed on the floor,
as though eye contact is too risky. And it isn't just peasants or workers anymore. You move into the offices of intellectuals, historians, poets, linguists, where the atmosphere is brittle. A professor gives a lecture about Russian medieval history, carefully avoiding any phrasing that might sound like criticism of the present. A poet burns old drafts that might be interpreted the wrong way. A translator hesitates over a borrowed German phrase in a manuscript, wondering if someone might accuse him of sympathizing with foreign enemies. You feel the pressure building inside official institutions too. The party itself becomes a target. Remember how Stalin once used the accusation of factionalism as a tool? Now the tool has become a weapon. Old Bolsheviks begin to sense the danger creeping closer. Some suddenly become more enthusiastic in speeches. Others rush to publish articles praising Stalin's policies. You watch one longtime party member stand in front of a mirror, practicing phrases of devotion until he gets the tone right. Because tone matters now. Tone can save or condemn. You overhear a conversation in a dim apartment. Two senior officials whisper about the rising number of arrests in neighboring districts. One man's hands shake. "It's not just enemies," he says. "It's people who hesitated." The other murmurs that hesitation is the new crime. A quirky detail that surfaces from your wandering. Some people took to sleeping fully dressed, with boots beside the bed and documents in a neat pile, because nighttime was when the NKVD typically came knocking. Better to be ready. Better to not look like you were hiding. Better, maybe, to give the impression that you were expecting them, because sometimes appearing too surprised was interpreted as guilt. Historians still debate whether Stalin believed the Soviet Union was filled with saboteurs, or whether he found that belief politically useful. The line between genuine paranoia and strategic terror has been a subject of research for decades, and the answers depend on which memoir, archive, or letter you examine. But you, standing here, can feel something deeper. A leader who sees control not as something you exercise occasionally, but as something you apply constantly, like pressure on a wound that can never heal. You move into a meeting of the security apparatus, the NKVD, where officers discuss categories of potential enemies. Some are vague, socially harmful elements, politically unreliable persons, and you realize how dangerously flexible these terms are. Almost anyone can be interpreted as fitting them. A person with foreign relatives, someone who doesn't speak Russian well enough, someone who once complained about grain shortages, someone who used to support the left opposition years ago and thought everyone forgot. No one forgets now. You step into the evening streets of Moscow again. Snow falls lightly, and the lamps cast long shadows across the pavement. A man walks briskly with his collar turned up, clutching a small briefcase. He isn't late. He isn't guilty. He isn't rebellious. But he moves like someone who knows that innocence is no longer a shield. And as you follow him down the street, listening to distant footsteps, watching windows darken one by one, you feel how the Soviet Union is changing shape under Stalin's logic. Anyone could be a threat. And soon, everyone will be treated like one. You continue walking forward through the tightening circuitry of Stalin's Soviet Union until the air changes again, sharper, colder, buzzing with a kind of electric dread that makes your skin prickle. It's late 1934 now. The corridors of Moscow are decorated with winter garlands, and on the surface, the city hums with its usual rhythms. But beneath the snow and street lamps, something is shifting. You feel it before you see it, like the hush that precedes a thunderclap. Everything you've witnessed, the paranoia, the suspicions, the logic of eliminating potential enemies, has been gathering momentum, and tonight, it finds its spark. You're standing outside the grand marble hallway of the Smolny Institute in Leningrad, soon to be renamed again and again, the building echoing with the footsteps of party officials Sergei Kirov, a beloved and popular member of the Communist Party leadership, walks briskly down the hallway. He's confident, well-liked, and most dangerously, far too admired by many within the party for Stalin's comfort. The mainstream historical fact rings clear. Kirov was one of the most prominent figures in the party, charismatic and approachable, and his popularity had begun to outshine even Stalin's in certain regional votes. Kirov pauses to exchange a friendly word with someone. He always does. He has that rare political magic. He can make people relax. You trail behind him, sensing warmth radiating off him like sunlight in a system where warmth is a suspicious luxury. Then the shot cracks. It's sharp, metallic, echoing against the stone walls. For a moment, everything freezes. The footsteps, the distant murmur of clerks, even your heartbeat. You hurry forward, slipping into that hallway where Kirov lies collapsed, blood threading across the polished floor like a red ribbon unraveling. A man named Leonid Nikolaev stands nearby, stunned, weapon still in hand. He's been described in reports as an expelled party member with grievances, debts, and personal disarray. But as guards rush in and shouts fill the air, you sense something stranger, something too convenient. The quirky tidbit here is a detail historians still puzzle over. Nikolaev, who was supposedly unstable and barely coordinated, had slipped past security checkpoints that mysteriously went understaffed that day. One guard had even been reassigned without explanation. You glance toward the doorway where guards should have been posted, and your stomach tightens, because you can feel it. This isn't just a murder, it's a tremor. Within hours, Stalin arrives in Leningrad. He walks the hallway slowly, expression carved into something unreadable. Some witnesses later claimed he touched the wall near the bullet hole, pausing as if in contemplation. Others said he looked genuinely shaken. Historians still argue whether Stalin orchestrated the assassination, allowed it to happen, or was blindsided by it but seized the opportunity ruthlessly. You stand here in the immediate aftermath, and truth feels slippery, oily, impossible to hold. But the effect, that you can grasp clearly. The assassination of Kirov becomes the detonator. You drift into Stalin's temporary office in Leningrad that night. Papers scatter the desk. Ash collects in a tray as cigarette after cigarette burns down. Stalin listens as NKVD chief Genrikh Yagoda gives details. Stalin's face barely moves, but something in his stillness feels dangerous. He says quietly, "This was organized, not asked, stated." And that one word, organized, opens the floodgates. You walk into a meeting of party leaders summoned urgently to Moscow. Stalin stands at the front of the room, voice low, steady, deliberate. Kirov's death, he says, proves that our enemies are not only outside, they are within. The sentence lands like a blow. People flinch. Some lower their gazes. Everyone feels the shift. Stalin tells them that the murder reveals a conspiracy, sabotage, hidden networks, plots, perhaps even within the party itself. A few officials exchange terrified glances. Because if the party can't trust its own members, what can it trust? You watch lists being drawn. Names of former oppositionists, skeptical writers, regional leaders who once hesitated too visibly, people who had publicly supported Kirov. The logic tightens around them like a net woven from fear and opportunity. You hear Stalin give the order to begin arrests of those connected to opposition groups, no matter how tenuous, no matter how theoretical. One official whispers to another, "This is only the beginning." The other whispers back, "Don't even say that. Walls have ears." They look around nervously, half expecting the walls to respond. The Kirov assassination becomes the state's justification to turn inward, to purge the party itself. You've seen repression before, but this feels different, targeted, systematic, and accompanied by a chilling certainty. The Stalinist view has hardened into granite. Threats don't just come from saboteurs, peasants, or foreigners. They come from comrades. You step into an interrogation room where an arrested party member sits hunched under a single lamp. A young NKVD officer reads from a script accusing him of participating in a terrorist group. The accused protests. He barely knew Kirov, had never spoken against Stalin, had never joined any faction. The officer shrugs. No one cares about truth anymore. Truth is whatever fills the blanks of the conspiracy narrative forming in Stalin's mind. The quirky detail here, whispered among terrified officials, is that Stalin kept telling different people different versions of the conspiracy. Sometimes it was Zinoviev, sometimes foreign agents, sometimes leftover Trotskyists. As one aide later put it, the story changed every day, but the arrests stayed the same. The NKVD moves quickly. People begin disappearing from party offices, from apartments, from meetings they never finish. By early 1935, the machinery is already in motion. Kirov's death isn't just a tragedy. It becomes permission. Permission to purge rivals. Permission to purge doubters. Permission to purge friends. Permission to purge the party itself. You stand on a Moscow street as rumors swirl. Every whispered conversation vibrating with dread. Someone mutters, "If they can kill Kirov, who is safe?" Someone else mutters back, "If they can blame anyone, who is innocent?" A group of factory workers marches solemnly behind a portrait of Kirov. Their grief is real, but the fear coating it is just as real. Kirov's face, once a symbol of hope within the party, is now a symbol of something darker. A reminder that loyalty offers no protection. Stalin returns to Moscow. His train cuts through the night, and as it arrives, the city feels like it inhales sharply. A new phase of Soviet life is beginning. You walk behind him as he steps onto the platform, surrounded by security, the night air cold enough to sting your lungs. He looks calm, focused, almost serene, because Kirov's death has given him exactly what he needed. A reason, an excuse, a catalyst. And through those doors ahead, the Great Purge is already unfolding. You move forward from the shock-soaked hallways of Leningrad, carrying the echo of that gunshot with you as the scene melts back into Moscow. The city looks the same. Trams rattling along frozen rails, street vendors huddling in scarves, apartments glowing faintly behind frosted windows. But you can feel the shift humming beneath every footstep. Kirov's body has barely cooled, and already the story around his death is mutating, expanding, twisting into something far larger than a single bullet. As you glide through offices and whispered conversations, you sense a strange fog thickening. Rumor, suspicion, and speculation swirl together until no one can tell where fact ends and convenient fiction begins. The mainstream historical fact anchors the moment. Sergei Kirov, one of the party's most beloved leaders, was murdered on the 1st of December 1934 by Leonid Nikolaevsky. But the circumstances of that murder, how Nikolaev got inside, why security was missing, why warnings were ignored, grow murky the more closely you look. And Stalin, who has an uncanny ability to turn ambiguity into opportunity, allows the mystery to expand like an ink stain. You drift into an office where NKVD officials gather to reconstruct the timeline of Kirov's assassination. Papers scatter across the table, and one officer traces red pencil over a map of Smolny's corridors. Others flip through Nikolaev's file, a disgruntled ex-party member, frequently unemployed, known to write angry letters that sound unhinged. But then you hear an officer mutter under his breath, "How did he get past security?" Another asks, "Why did he have a pass the week before?" A third whispers, "Why were Kirov's bodyguards reassigned?" Historians still argue whether the NKVD was negligent, complicit, or caught off guard. Some point to testimonies suggesting Nikolaev was under surveillance for weeks. Others highlight the almost unbelievable coincidence that the guard posted outside Kirov's office was moved, without explanation, minutes before the shooting. And then there are letters, diaries, and later accounts that hint at possible orchestration. But documents contradict each other, and witnesses contradict themselves, leaving scholars chasing shadows. You stand among these contradictions, feeling like every piece of evidence has a twin that points in the opposite direction. A quirky tidbit floats in from the margins. Nikolaev's revolver was reportedly so unreliable that NKVD officers joked he couldn't have hit the floor if he dropped it. Yet somehow, on that day, in that hallway, his shot lands perfectly.
The detail seems almost too theatrical. You slide deeper into the room where the NKVD chief, Yagoda, sits rigidly, insisting they had no prior knowledge of Nikolaev's intentions. His voice sounds rehearsed, brittle. Across from him, a Politburo member asks carefully whether more security had been requested for Kirov earlier that month. Yagoda dodges. You can almost see him calculating which answers will preserve his position, and which might mark him as the next target. Next door, Stalin meets with senior officials. You watch him pace, slowly, methodically, like a man assembling a narrative, piece by piece. His voice is soft, never rising, but the room feels like it shrinks with every word he speaks. There was a conspiracy, he says, a carefully planned attack. His tone carries absolute certainty, even though evidence is thin. And the remarkable thing? No one challenges him, not because they agree, but because challenging Stalin's version of reality has become synonymous with self-destruction. You drift beside an aide, who later writes in his diary that Stalin kept changing his explanation. One day, he blames the left opposition, the next, Latvian fascists. Another day, foreign spies. The story keeps shifting, like a kaleidoscope of accusations. But the conclusion never changes. Internal enemies must exist because Stalin says they do.
The room fills with tension as the implications sink in. If Kirov's killing is proof of an internal conspiracy, then anyone associated with past opposition movements becomes vulnerable. Anyone who criticized collectivization, anyone who once voted against Stalin in regional elections, anyone who wasn't enthusiastic enough in yesterday's meeting. You drift into the apartment of a mid-level party member who is reading the news bulletin aloud to his wife. His hands shake slightly. Kirov killed by Trotskyites, he reads. Then he checks another bulletin. Kirov murdered by a foreign organized terrorist group. A third headline claims Zinoviev's center masterminded the plot. His wife frowns. How can it be all of them? He folds the paper quickly and says, "Better not ask." People begin repeating the official line, even before they fully understand it. The logic is contagious. If Stalin says it was a conspiracy, then it was a conspiracy. A man in a factory canteen whispers, "Stalin will find who did it." Another replies, "He already knows." The first man nods, terrified, because either answer could mean trouble. You float into a dim interrogation room where a suspect, once a minor party activist, is being questioned about ties to Nikolaev. He has none, but his interrogator isn't asking questions to find truth. He's fishing for names, connections, associations, anything that can expand the supposed conspiracy outward. The suspect insists on his innocence until the interrogator slides a confession template across the table. "It's easier if you agree," he says, "for both of us." The quirky tidbit here comes from a whisper among NKVD officers. New confession templates were printed before some arrests were even made. You drift upward through the stairwell, into an archive room where Stalin's signature sits on fresh directives authorizing widespread arrests related to the Kirov conspiracy. The documents broaden the definition of guilt to include anyone who might have once ideologically sympathized with opposition positions. It's a net woven from speculation and fear. Historians still debate Stalin's personal involvement in Kirov's murder. Some say he orchestrated it. Some say he allowed it. Some say he exploited it. But as you stand in these rooms, watching panic spread like ink in water, you see the one thing scholars agree on. Kirov's death gave Stalin the perfect justification to unleash a wave of repression that transformed Soviet politics forever. You walk outside into the cold Moscow night. Snow crunches beneath your feet. People hurry home, glancing at shadows, clutching coats tight around them. Someone mutters, "If they could kill Kirov, no one is untouchable." Someone else whispers, "If they can blame anyone, no one is innocent." Above you, the Kremlin windows glow softly, and behind them, Stalin shapes the story that will reshape the world. Kirov is gone. The truth is buried. and the purge is ready to burst open. You step forward into a dim corridor that seems to stretch endlessly, lined with heavy wooden doors and the distant echo of footsteps that don't match any visible figure. You know instinctively where you're headed, deeper into the heart of the emerging terror. The air tastes like old tobacco smoke and freshly printed propaganda, two scents that define this era. And as you turn the next corner, you feel history gathering itself into a theatrical pose, because what comes now isn't just repression, it's performance, spectacle, a show trial staged for an audience of millions, scripted by fear, directed by Stalin, and performed by men who once stood at the center of the revolution. You're ushered into a courtroom in Moscow in August 1936, the first of the famous Moscow trials, where prominent Bolsheviks Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev sit under harsh lights. Once, they were giants, revered revolutionaries, named in the same breath as Lenin. Now, they look like ghosts of themselves, pale, exhausted, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Under the bright overhead bulbs, the room feels like a theater with too many seats and not enough exits. The mainstream historical fact settles thickly in the room. Zinoviev and Kamenev confess publicly to fantastic conspiracies, plots to assassinate Stalin, sabotage industry, work with Trotsky, and even with Nazi Germany. Confessions extracted under immense pressure, coercion, and fear for their families. You watch the prosecutor, Andrei Vyshinsky, stride into the spotlight with the gusto of a man performing for an invisible camera. His voice booms with theatrical outrage, calling the defendants dogs, contemptible degenerates, and rats. His language is so heavy-handed it almost feels like a parody, except the stakes are deadly real. You feel your stomach tighten as he leans forward and bellows, "Confess your monstrous crimes against the state." The audience shifts uneasily. Some nod. Some look puzzled. Others look terrified not to nod. Zinoviev rises, trembling. He confesses in a flat, numbed voice, statements you sense he has rehearsed under duress. His tone is hollow, like someone reading lines he no longer believes in. Kamenev follows, eyes downcast, speaking slowly, as if each word digs its own grave. The quirky tidbit emerges in the whispers behind you. Some defendants in these trials practiced their confessions in front of NKVD instructors, who corrected their tone, pace, and emphasis, polishing the performance for maximum impact. You glance at the spectators. Some are true believers, their faces alight with righteous fury. Others stare forward blankly, knowing they must appear convinced no matter what they feel inside. You see one man, a mid-level party worker, furiously taking notes as if the intensity of his scribbling might protect him from suspicion. But the strangest part? There is no evidence, no documents, no intercepted communications, no credible witnesses. The confessions are the evidence, and everyone pretends the loop makes sense. Historians still argue how many of these confessions were extracted through torture, threats, psychological manipulation, or threats to family members. Memoirs from later decades suggest every tactic you can imagine, and a few you can't, was used. But here, inside this courtroom, none of that is visible. All you see are two men sacrificing themselves on a stage built to demonstrate Stalin's total power. You drift forward as if drawn by the momentum of the trial, and stand beside the judge's bench just long enough to notice the way officials exchange quick glances with NKVD officers standing in the back. This isn't justice, it's choreography. Outside the courtroom during breaks, journalists fabricate details that will print as truth tomorrow. A foreign correspondent whispers that the charges are absurd, but he writes them anyway because his paper back home loves sensational stories. Another correspondent mutters, "This is theater, not law," then adds, "But what choice do they have?" The walls here don't just have ears, they swallow doubts whole. When the verdict is announced, death sentences for Zinoviev and Kamenev, the courtroom erupts into a mixture of applause, fear, and mechanical chanting. The men are escorted away. One of them turns his head slightly, as if hoping to see a familiar face in the crowd. he doesn't find one. You watch his expression crumple briefly before the guards push him out of sight. You follow the crowd spilling outside into the Moscow air. Posters proclaim, "Enemies of the people, exposed," as if the city itself must participate in the spectacle. One man tacks up a flyer while glancing over his shoulder, terrified someone might accuse him of not hammering it energetically enough. Another man mutters that the trial felt too perfect, then immediately pretends he didn't say it. Back inside the courthouse, preparations begin for the next performance. Stalin isn't present physically. He doesn't need to be. His presence saturates the walls, the paperwork, the trembling fear in every attendee. The trial has achieved exactly what he wanted: the public destruction of old Bolsheviks who once challenged or doubted him, and a message to the entire party that no past loyalty provides protection. A quirky detail whispered among NKVD staff. Vyshinsky rehearsed his insults in front of a mirror, testing which lines sounded the most thunderous. It's grotesque, but fitting. This is not a judicial process, but a theatrical production with Stalin as the invisible director. You move into a small office where a junior NKVD clerk sharpens pencils mechanically. He's copying names from an old list of former oppositionists onto a new list of suspects. When you ask, in a whisper, what the difference is, he hesitates. The first list was about politics, he murmurs. The second list is about survival. He keeps writing. Historians still debate whether the trials were intended primarily as propaganda, political elimination, or mass intimidation. But you, standing in this moment, can feel the answer is all of them. The trials broadcast terror into every corner of Soviet society. They taught people that even the highest-ranking revolutionaries could be unmade overnight, that confessing doesn't save you, that loyalty doesn't protect you, that no one is too prominent, too important, too foundational to be torn down. As you leave the courtroom, the light flickering overhead feels colder than before. The floorboards creak with echoes of confessions, accusations, verdicts, all carefully scripted to prepare the nation for what comes next. Because this was only the first trial, and behind the next door, the next stage is already being built. You move forward again, gliding out of that first courtroom and slipping into a heavier, darker corridor where the air feels thicker, almost humid with dread. If the first Moscow trial was a warning shot, what comes next feels like the moment the doors slam shut. The show trials grow wider, louder, more elaborate, and far more deadly. And as you drift deeper into late 1936 and then into 1937 and 1938, you sense that Stalin has perfected his script. It isn't just aimed at old Bolsheviks anymore, it's aimed at everyone. You enter a new courtroom in January 1937. Sharper lights, more guards, longer tables. This is the second Moscow trial, sometimes called the Trial of the 17. The defendants sit rigidly in chairs that seem designed to expose their trembling. Engineers, economists, party officials, men who once drafted industrial plans, wrote ideological essays, and ran major factories, now stare straight ahead with hollowed-out expressions. The mainstream historical fact is unmistakable. These trials broadened the scope of accusations from political treason to economic sabotage, espionage, and fantastical alliances with foreign powers. The charges stretch the imagination like a rubber band about to snap. One defendant claims he plotted with German intelligence. Another confesses to intentionally damaging machinery. A third admits he was part of a parallel anti-Soviet Trotskyist center, a phrase so convoluted it sounds like the name of a bad underground jazz club. You can almost hear the skepticism in the room. But skepticism has become a banned emotion. Over in the corner, Vyshinsky is at it again. His voice is sharper this time, less theatrical and more venomous. He paces like a man testing the echo of his boots. He points, he shouts, he pounds the table with a fist that trembles not from anger, but from adrenaline. His insults become more elaborate. Traitors, parasitic degenerates, filthy vipers.
each word thrown like a stone meant to shatter whatever dignity the defendants still hold. You notice something new. The audience is larger, the press more international, the propaganda machinery louder. It's a performance designed to show the entire world that Stalin is untouchable, that opposition, even theoretical, imaginary, or extinct, will be ripped apart. A quirky tidbit floats in the back of your mind. Some foreign correspondents attending the trials later admitted they wrote their articles half tongue-in-cheek because even they couldn't believe the charges. One quipped privately that the defendants appeared guilty of whatever the script required that morning, but none of them said so in print. Not then. As you sit quietly at the back of the room, you observe something far more disturbing: how the trials change the audience. People start cheering before the prosecutor even finishes a sentence. They stand when Vyshinsky demands it. They gasp on cue. The whole room bends itself to the rhythm of staged outrage. It's mass participation in unreality. Then, you drift forward in time into early 1938, into the third Moscow trial, the trial of the 21. This one is the most dramatic, the most shocking, the most politically devastating. At the center sits Nikolai Bukharin, former editor of Pravda, brilliant intellectual, and once one of Lenin's favorite protégés. He was a man known for humor, warmth, and even artistic talent. Quirky detail incoming. Bukharin used to draw cartoonish little elephants and monkeys in the margins of his notes during meetings. But now, he looks like a shadow wearing his own clothes. You lean in as he speaks, voice calm but cracked in places. He confesses to espionage, sabotage, and plotting assassinations. Crimes so wildly unbelievable that even some officials shift nervously in their seats. His confession feels philosophical, almost poetic, like he's trying to tell two truths at once: the spoken one, forced and rehearsed, and the silent one, that he knows he's walking toward death to protect others. Historians still argue whether Bukharin tried to embed hidden messages in his confession, verbal fingerprints indicating he was speaking under duress. Some say yes, reading nuance in his pauses. Others say the idea is wishful thinking. Either way, the moment feels heavy enough to bruise the air. The trial expands beyond high politics. Engineers, writers, journalists, priests, statisticians, economists, every profession becomes suspect. You walk through hallways where posters urge citizens to expose wreckers. School children memorize lines about vigilance. Workers attend mandatory meetings to discuss saboteurs in their midst. It's as if the entire country has been instructed to participate in a nationwide group hallucination. In one factory, you see a worker dragged before his comrades and accused of intentionally damaging equipment. His real crime? Reporting a malfunction. His co-workers denounce him, some with trembling voices, others with frantic enthusiasm. You understand why. Refusing to denounce can look like complicity. In a church hidden between warehouses, priests whisper prayers behind locked doors, aware that religious figures are now being targeted for counter-revolutionary influence. One priest hides icons under floorboards, hoping to protect them from confiscation. A quirky detail whispered among believers. Some icons were hidden inside hollowed-out loaves of black bread, an improvised method of camouflage. Back in Moscow, the NKVD's workload multiplies. Arrests accelerate, files thicken, phones tap, lists grow long. You pass an NKVD officer slumped at his desk, head in his hands. He mutters, "There are quotas now." Quotas. He sounds as if even he can't believe it. But quotas indeed exist. A set number of arrests that must be met, regardless of guilt, evidence, or logic. If a district fails to produce enough enemies, it becomes suspect itself. Historians still argue whether the mass operations were planned in detail or improvised in terror. But from where you're standing, it doesn't matter. The effect is the same. The purge balloons outward,
engulfing engineers, clerks, doctors, musicians, peasants, postal workers, and anyone whose existence crosses a bureaucratic line at the wrong moment. You slip back into the courtroom just as the third Moscow trial reaches its climax. Bukharin stands tall, almost serene. You imagine he's remembering the early days of the revolution, when everything felt possible. Now, he stares at the judges, his expression carved from equal parts resignation and defiance. The verdict is announced. Death. The room erupts into applause. You hear none of it. You hear only the quiet thought hovering above it all. The understanding that the trials were never about truth, never about justice, never even about the defendants. They were about Stalin telling the nation, "I can unmake anyone." And as you step outside into the biting wind, past posters plastered with triumphant slogans, you feel the country itself shifting under the weight of that message. The trials are over. The terror is far from done. You step forward again, deeper into the machinery of fear, and the courtroom lights fade behind you. What rises in their place is something darker, more mechanical, more brutal. The show trials were loud, theatrical, public. But what comes now, the mass operations of 1937 to 38, is quiet in comparison, yet infinitely more deadly. You feel it immediately in the temperature of the air. It's colder, not winter cold, but system cold, the chill of bureaucracy weaponized. You move into a large NKVD administrative office where stacks of papers sit like miniature tombstones on every desk. Officers lean over them, stamping, signing, cross-referencing, rubber stamping. The mainstream historical fact stands firm. The summer of 1937 marks the beginning of the Great Terror's deadliest phase, triggered by a Politburo directive on the 2nd of July and operationalized by NKVD Order number 00447. That order launches the infamous Kulak operation, opening the gates to mass arrests and executions across the Soviet Union. You drift between desks, watching officers categorize entire populations into neat columns. Kulaks, criminals, anti-Soviet elements, former oppositionists, nationalists, ethnic minorities, and even socially harmful persons. It's astonishing and horrifying how quickly humans become numbers. One officer murmurs, "We need more names to fill the quota," while another replies, "But we already exceeded last month's." The first one shrugs, "Exceeding is loyalty." A quirky tidbit drifts into your ear. Some districts, afraid of seeming insufficiently vigilant, arrested entire village councils simply because they were running out of suspects. Imagine being targeted not for what you did, but because someone else needed to look busy. This room, humming with typewriters, represents something essential about the purge. It functioned like an industrial process. You can almost hear the rhythm of its gears. Investigate, arrest, interrogate, convict, execute. Repeating with metronomic precision. Every stamp, every signature, every folder passed across a desk brings another life closer to ruin. You step into a corridor where NKVD officers line up daily reports. They tally arrests like production quotas. You watch one officer with tired eyes read out numbers to his superior. 270 arrests, 190 executions. His voice is flat, routine, as if he's reporting wheat shipments. His superior nods approvingly. "We must maintain momentum," he says. "Enemies don't rest." Historians still argue how much of this terror came from Stalin's direct instructions versus local officials acting out of fear or ambition. Some believe Stalin approved every major directive. Others note that regional leaders often inflated numbers to impress Moscow or to protect themselves by demonstrating overzealous loyalty. Standing here, listening to the scramble for higher arrest figures, you feel how the terror became self-fueling, a forest fire that fed on both commands and fear. You move now beyond the city, into villages and small towns nearly swallowed by darkness. NKVD trucks rumble through muddy streets at night,
Houses are marked quietly, chalk on a fence. A note slipped under a door, a whispered warning. You hear a dog bark, then go silent. A door creaks open. A woman clings to her husband as officers read out charges in monotone. Article 58, Anti-Soviet Activity. She begs for an explanation. There is none. Officers don't need evidence. They need names. You stand in a cramped room where an officer reads from a pre-written confession template. The accused signs, not because he's guilty, but because signing seems like the only way to protect his family. You feel the moment he breaks, shoulders sagging, eyes dimming, as if the ink in the pen drains something from him. A quirky detail whispers from the edge of the scene. In some regions, NKVD interrogators used accelerated interviews that lasted only 10 minutes. 10 minutes to decide someone's fate. 10 minutes between life and disappearance. You move next to a prison cell where dozens of people huddle together. Engineers, shoemakers, teachers, farmers, none of them know why they're here. Some try to sleep. Others whisper rumors. They said we were planning sabotage. They accused us of hoarding grain. They say someone named me in their confession. A man sobs quietly into his hands. Another stares at the ceiling, repeating a prayer he learned from his grandmother, even though prayer is forbidden now. Historians still debate whether NKVD Order 00447 was designed primarily to eliminate potential rebels or to terrorize the population into compliance. The truth, you sense, lies somewhere in the bleak middle. A combination of paranoia, vengeance, and systematic control. The order doesn't just target past opponents. It targets people who might oppose the regime someday. Guilt becomes a time machine, projecting from the future backward. You drift into a cramped NKVD tribunal, what they called a troika. 3 officials sit at a table, reviewing case files in minutes. They stamp verdicts rapidly. Category 1, execution. Category 2, labor camp. The process is so fast, so mechanical, it barely feels human. A life judged in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. You linger for a moment as one troika member hesitates over a file. He's a war veteran, he whispers. He fought with us. Another responds sharply. If he were loyal, he wouldn't be on this list. They stamp Category 1. Outside the tribunal, relatives wait in long, cold lines demanding news. They're told nothing. Some bring food parcels that are never delivered. Some receive letters months later, informing them their loved one has been sentenced for anti-Soviet agitation. The language is vague. The pain is precise. You walk into a forest clearing at dawn. Frost clings to the grass. A row of men stand silently, hands bound. NKVD officers stand behind them. You hear one officer whisper, "We're behind schedule." A shot breaks the morning stillness, then another, then another. The forest absorbs it all without judgment. Back in the cities, propaganda posters praise the cleansing of society. Newspapers list enemies of the people in bold print. Citizens read the lists nervously, scanning for familiar names. A quirky tidbit: some people checked the lists daily, not to see if their friends had been arrested, but to make sure they hadn't been forgotten. Because being forgotten meant you could vanish at any moment. The mass operations continue relentlessly. The numbers swell, hundreds of thousands arrested, hundreds of thousands executed. Ethnic minorities targeted, religious figures vanished, entire neighborhoods decimated. And yet, in the rhythm of everyday life, trams still run, factories still hum, children still attend school, because terror doesn't stop the world, it infects it. And as you stand in a silent Moscow alleyway at the end of a long, harrowing night, you feel the truth settle into your bones. This is no longer fear. This is policy, and the purge is far from over. You step forward again, the paper mountains of Order 00447 fading behind you as the world around you shifts. The corridors of NKVD offices dissolve, and in their place rises a haunting patchwork of train stations, border towns,
dimly lit apartments, and crowded holding cells. If the last section felt like the engine room of the Great Terror, this one is the map spread across the table. The operations aimed not just at class enemies, but at entire nations within the Soviet Union. The purge now expands sideways, outward, downward, reaching into the identities of people who never imagined they could be targets. You feel the landscape tense beneath your feet. It's 1937 to 38, and Stalin's logic has taken a new turn. Certain ethnic groups, simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, are considered security threats. The mainstream historical fact anchors this grim reality. The NKVD launched a series of national operations, the largest of which was the Polish operation, which led to around 143,000 arrests and roughly 111,000 executions. Ethnic Poles, who made up a tiny percentage of the population, became massively overrepresented among victims. Other groups targeted included Latvians, Germans, Finns, Koreans, Iranians, Chinese, Estonians, and more. Entire identities turned into potential conspiracies. You find yourself standing in a cramped communal apartment in a border town. A Polish family sits at a wooden table, sharing a simple dinner. They speak quietly in a mix of Polish and Russian, swapping stories about harsh harvests and rumors drifting in from nearby villages. The father glances at the door every so often, as if expecting a knock he can't bring himself to mention. His daughter hums softly, a tune she learned from her grandmother, but her mother tells her to shh, not because it's loud, but because joy in this atmosphere feels dangerous. A quirky tidbit surfaces like a shiver. Some families, fearing they might be targeted as foreign agents, buried their family photos in the garden, convinced that smiling faces in traditional dress might be used as evidence. Imagine being afraid of your own history. Suddenly, the hallway light flickers. A knock. Heavy, deliberate. Officers step inside and read a charge sheet in monotone. Participation in a Polish military organization. The father stares blankly at the words. He doesn't even know such an organization exists, but it doesn't matter. Names and categories are now destiny. He's arrested. His wife cries silently into her hands as the officers march him down the stairs. You follow behind, hearing neighbors whisper behind cracked doors. No one dares intervene. Historians still argue why Stalin targeted these groups so intensely. Some say he feared foreign infiltration along vulnerable borders. Others argue he viewed national minorities as inherently disloyal. Some point to internal NKVD pressures, quotas, rivalries, and fears of not doing enough. Whatever the reason, the results spread like wildfire through border regions, cities, and rural enclaves across the USSR. You drift next into a small NKVD command center. Officers shuffle thick stacks of documents detailing ethnic fronts. The maps are color-coded, pins marking clusters of suspected foreign agents. The labels feel absurdly broad. Polish Espionage Center, German Section, Latvian Sabotage Group. One officer yawns as he writes up arrest orders for dozens of people he has never met. Another lights a cigarette, muttering, "This will never end." His colleague replies sharply, "It ends when Moscow says it ends." You lean over a file that lists the charges of a Polish shoemaker. He's accused of spying through footwear. The absurdity catches in your throat, but no one here laughs. You travel to the Far East now, where a Korean community prepares for forced relocation. Families pack bundles, clutching rice bowls, icons, and yellowed letters. Children cling to their mothers' coats, confused by the sudden order to board trains heading west into Kazakhstan. The official line calls it preventing Japanese espionage. But as you watch people board the trains in silence, you see the truth. They are pawns in a geopolitical paranoia they never asked to be part of. A quirky detail emerges here. Some Korean families believe they were being moved temporarily for seasonal work because officials lied to prevent panic. Many brought gardening tools, seeds, and homemade pickles. thinking they'd return home in spring. Most never did. You drift into an interrogation room in an NKVD facility in Minsk. A man with Latvian heritage sits across from an officer who asks him how often he's communicated with Latvian fascist centers. The man tries to explain that he hasn't left the country since childhood, that he barely speaks Latvian anymore, that he's a bookkeeper, not a spy. The officer nods, writes something down, and signals for guards. You glance at his report. The verdict was decided before the man walked in. Historians still debate how much Stalin believed these far-fetched conspiracies. Some argue he saw ethnic purges as preventative strikes against imagined future wars. Others say he interpreted cultural differences as potential disloyalty. Still others point to his long-standing distrust of border populations, especially Poles, Germans, and Finns. But what you feel here, standing in the middle of these operations, is a simpler truth. The purge no longer needs reasons, it needs categories. You walk into a factory where workers are gathered for a cleansing meeting. A supervisor nervously reads out names of employees suspected of nationalist tendencies. A man with German ancestry stands up, trembling, insisting he has never once left the USSR. A coworker who has known him for 20 years stares at the floor, afraid to speak. Silence becomes weaponized. Everyone is scared to defend, scared to question, scared to breathe too loudly. At night, in cities like Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk, NKVD trucks rumble through neighborhoods where Polish, Jewish, and German families live. Windows stay dark. Curtains don't move. People sleep with their boots on, passports under pillows, children tucked between parents, as if proximity can shield them. You step into a chilly cell block filled with detainees awaiting processing. They speak a symphony of languages: Polish, Yiddish, German, Russian, Ukrainian, Latvian. Some pray. Some whisper promises to protect their loved ones. Some stare blankly at the wall, already gone in spirit. And all the while, the lists grow. Names feed the machine. Arrests accelerate. Executions mount. The mainstream fact hits again. Ethnic minorities made up a small percentage of the Soviet population, yet were disproportionately represented among execution victims. Poles over 12%. Latvians, similar proportions. Germans targeted heavily. It's demographic violence on a chilling scale. You step outside into a field dusted with frost. It's quiet. Birds are silent. The horizon is pale and empty. And in that stark stillness, you feel the terrible weight of what has happened. People were punished not for what they did, not for what they believed, but for who they were. And the purge, swollen now with blood and suspicion, continues to expand. The terror hasn't peaked yet. You move forward again, and now the walls around you change. The cramped communal apartments, the NKVD offices stuffed with trembling clerks, the border towns fatigued by ethnic purges, all fade. What rises in their place is something far more ominous. Barracks, drill yards, maps tacked onto walls with red pins, and officers' boots clicking sharply on concrete floors. You've entered the heart of another institution that will soon feel the squeeze of Stalin's terror: the Red Army. It's 1937. The Soviet Union's armed forces, massive, proud, and central to the revolution's survival, stand poised on the edge of quiet catastrophe. You can sense it immediately in the air. Tension thicker than cigarette smoke, whispers that stop abruptly when boots approach, the constant feeling that the walls themselves might be informants. The mainstream historical fact comes sharply into focus. A substantial portion of the Red Army's leadership, once thought to be untouchable, will soon be arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Earlier narratives exaggerated the numbers wildly, claiming half the officer corps vanished. More recent research suggests around 4 to 8% of officers were purged, with many reinstated later. But even at those lower figures,
The psychological and strategic damage was enormous.
You're standing now outside a wide training yard where officers run drills. Their faces are stern, but beneath the surface, you see strain. One officer shouts commands crisply, but his eyes dart toward the building behind him as if expecting someone to walk out with an arrest order. Another adjusts his coat nervously. A third tries to lighten the mood with a joke, but it lands flat. They know better now. Humor is risky when lives turn on interpretations. A quirky tidbit drifts your way. Some officers in this period reportedly stopped writing personal diaries out of fear their private thoughts might be discovered and read as treason. Not even the privacy of a locked drawer felt safe. You drift into a strategy room where maps of Europe are spread across a large table. Germany is rearming. Japan is expanding. Tensions simmer everywhere along Soviet borders. But instead of discussing military reforms, the room is filled with interrogators, questioning commanders about their connections, their loyalties, their ideological purity. One officer swears he has never had contact with foreign agents. Another insists he has always supported Stalin's policies. A third looks down at his hands that once held the fate of battalions, and whispers, "I don't understand what I'm accused of." Historians still argue why Stalin turned on his own armed forces. Some say he feared an internal coup. Others suggest he never forgave the military for Trotsky's legacy. After all, Trotsky founded the Red Army. Still others point to fabricated evidence pushed by the NKVD, which Stalin accepted because it aligned with his worldview. From your vantage point here, drifting among these trembling officers, the reason feels chillingly simple. Stalin trusted no institution powerful enough to threaten him, not even the army designed to defend his state. You walk down a narrow hallway toward an office where Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the brightest military minds in the Soviet Union, is being interrogated. His posture is straight, even elegant, but exhaustion stains the edges of his composure. Tukhachevsky was a modernizer, a strategist, a man with ideas decades ahead of his time. He pushed for mechanization, combined arms operations, and a more flexible military doctrine. In another timeline, he might have shaped Soviet victories. But in this timeline, this one you're floating inside, his brilliance becomes a liability. The interrogators accuse him of plotting with the Germans. They present forged documents. The air is thick with lies. Tukhachevsky signs a confession under duress, and within days he is executed. You feel the echo of that event ripple through the officer corps. If a marshal can fall so easily, what hope does anyone else have? You slip into a barracks where junior officers huddle around a dim light. One mutters, "If the marshal wasn't safe, none of us are." Another whispers, "Maybe loyalty is dangerous now." The irony hangs heavy. A third says nothing at all, staring at his boots, polishing them nervously even though they're already clean. Soon, directives ripple through military districts. Arrests spread from Moscow outward like frost creeping across winter windows. Officers from tank brigades, engineering divisions, artillery regiments, no branch is untouched. You watch a commander being taken away as his soldiers stand in formation, faces blank, trained to show no reaction. When he disappears inside the truck, one soldier closes his eyes briefly, the only sign of emotion he dares express. You drift into a training session where a nervous lieutenant tries to explain tactics that were once Tukhachevsky's innovations. His voice trembles. He edits himself constantly, terrified that praising the executed marshal might be interpreted as sympathy. His students pretend not to notice, but you see the tension in their jawlines, their stiff shoulders. Historians still debate the exact strategic effects of this military purge. Some argue the Red Army's performance during the early months of the German invasion in 1941 was crippled by the loss of experienced leadership. Others point out that despite setbacks, the army adapted quickly and ultimately triumphed. The truth is nuanced. The purge left gaps in leadership,
fostered a climate of fear, forced rapid promotions of inexperienced officers, and disrupted modernization efforts. But it didn't destroy the army. It destabilized it. And that destabilization had consequences. You walk into a warehouse where dusty crates of military equipment sit unopened. A technician explains that part of the chaos came from fear of being accused of mishandling state property. Soldiers hesitated to report failures. Technicians avoided innovative repairs. Commanders made conservative decisions, even in training, because mistakes could be fatal. A quirky, unsettling detail. In some units, soldiers began keeping their own equipment under lock and key, not to protect it from theft, but to ensure no one could tamper with it and accuse them of sabotage. You drift into another interrogation room. This one's smaller, dimmer, colder. A veteran of the Civil War is questioned about his past loyalties. They ask why he once supported the left opposition 15 years ago. He tries to explain that almost everyone debated policies back then. The interrogator shakes his head. You should have known better. The phrase feels like an anchor thrown into the depths. In the quiet aftermath of another night of arrests, you find yourself walking along a military base's perimeter fence. Dawn begins to seep into the horizon in a pale wash of pink and gray. Soldiers shuffle out for morning drills, their movements stiff with cold, and something else. The knowledge that the institution meant to defend the country is now unable to defend itself. And as you watch their breath rise in small white clouds, you understand something haunting. The Great Purge didn't need to destroy the Red Army. It only needed to frighten it, to make it compliant, to make it look inward instead of outward. Because any institution that fears itself can't challenge the one who built the fear. And the purge rolls on, heavier and darker than ever. You move forward again, stepping out of the barracks and away from the echoing footsteps of terrified officers. What surrounds you now isn't a single institution or a specific operation. It's the entire country, reshaped like wet clay under the pressure of fear. The purges have spread so widely, seeped so deeply into the pores of Soviet life that everything, workplaces, homes, friendships, even private thoughts, feels soaked in dread. And as you breathe in this air, you sense the long shadows of the Great Purge stretching outward, touching foreign perceptions, war planning, everyday rituals, and the very architecture of Soviet identity. You stand in a Moscow street at dusk, snow falling gently, but the city feels muted, like a painting drained of color. People walk briskly, hands tucked into coats, staring straight ahead. But it's not simply winter making them cold. It's caution. It's vigilance. It's the reflex that now governs daily life. Don't speak too loudly. Don't ask too much. Don't linger too long. The mainstream historical fact forms the spine of everything you're witnessing. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin's Great Purge reshaped Soviet politics and society through mass arrests, executions, deportations, show trials, and coerced confessions, instilling a climate of fear that touched every layer of the population. But facts alone don't capture what you feel here. Fear isn't just a sensation, it's a landscape. And as you move through it, you realize it has become the operating system of the USSR. You wander into a worker's dormitory near a metallurgical plant. The men sit on bunks, polishing boots, mending coats, writing letters they'll never send. Not because the post office can't deliver them, but because no one wants to risk saying something wrong. A newspaper lies on a table, open to a list of arrested anti-Soviet elements. One worker scans the names silently, searching for someone he knows, not because he wants to find them, but because he dreads the surprise of not knowing who has vanished. You overhear another worker whisper, "They got Sergei from the lathe shop. They said he was sabotaging bearings." His friend's eyes widen. He just filed a complaint about broken machines. The whisper dies. Silence is safer. A quirky tidbit floats through your mind. Some Soviet citizens developed a habit of speaking in code about political topics.
using phrases like, "The weather is dangerous today," to refer to crackdowns. It seems darkly humorous, until you remember that humor itself could be incriminating. You drift now into a school classroom, where a teacher writes formulas on the chalkboard, but her eyes flick constantly toward the doorway. Her students recite patriotic slogans with robotic precision. Above the blackboard hangs a portrait of Stalin, watching from on high. A child raises his hand to report that his father complained about bread shortages. The teacher freezes. She nods slowly and says, "You did the right thing." Her smile is trembling. Later, she will go home and cry quietly because she knows what such a report means and that she cannot undo it. Historians still argue whether Stalin intended the purge to permeate everyday life this thoroughly, or whether the terror spiraled beyond even his expectations. Some scholars insist he micromanaged the entire mechanism. Others argue that local officials amplified the purge to protect themselves. But as you stand in these spaces, schoolrooms, factories, kitchens, you sense that fear has become a cultural reflex. It no longer needs orders. It sustains itself. Walk now into an apartment hallway in Leningrad. The walls are peeling, cracked from cold. But what hits you first isn't the appearance, it's the compulsive quiet. Families sit on opposite sides of thin walls, careful with every sound. A mother whispers bedtime stories to her daughter with a steadiness she doesn't feel. In the kitchen, water drips from a faucet, each drop loud in the suffocating silence. Then suddenly, you hear footsteps in the stairwell. Heavy boots, several of them. You see lights flick on under doors as people wake instantly. Mothers hold children close. Men adjust collars, straighten shirts, preparing themselves mentally for the worst. The boots pass. They stop 2 doors down. A woman screams. Someone is taken away. Then the hallway goes quiet again, except for the drip of water and the muffled sobs behind a closed door. You move next to the world beyond Soviet borders. Foreign governments watch these developments with alarm. In Berlin, Nazi strategists misinterpret the purge as proof that the Red Army has been crippled, an assumption that will later embolden Hitler's decision to invade. In London and Paris, diplomats shake their heads, concluding that the USSR is unpredictable and unstable. Historians still debate how deeply the purge influenced foreign calculations, but you can feel how perceptions harden. The USSR becomes a riddle, powerful but erratic, industrializing rapidly but devouring its own elites. You drift through a Soviet propaganda office. Artists sketch posters showing heroic workers defeating enemies of the people. Writers draft articles celebrating the cleansing of society. One journalist stops typing and rubs his face, exhausted. He whispers to a colleague, "Who are we reassuring, ourselves or the world?" No one answers. In another room, a historian nervously rewrites a chapter of a textbook because one of the figures he previously praised has been arrested. He erases names, redraws portraits, rewrites sentences. The quirky detail here is that some Soviet textbooks had entire people literally airbrushed out of photographs. History is edited as easily as a newspaper headline. You step into a military barracks again, but this time the mood is different. It's not the fear of arrest, it's the fear of inadequacy. Young officers, suddenly promoted far beyond their experience, study tactics late into the night, not because they're ambitious, but because they're terrified of failing. Mistakes now are interpreted as treason. You walk through the countryside again too. Villages feel emptier, fields lie fallow, churches have been boarded shut. Entire family lines have been broken by arrests and deportations. People visit cemeteries quietly, leaving flowers for graves that bear no names because no one knows where the bodies really lie. The country survives. Factories run, trains move, armies drill, children learn. But beneath it all is the sense that society itself has clenched its jaw so tightly
it might never unclench. And as you stand on a bridge overlooking a frozen river at dusk, you feel the long shadow stretching across the landscape. The shadow of a regime that has fused fear with governance, suspicion with policy, and silence with survival.
The Great Purge didn't just reshape the Soviet Union, it rewired it. And the final reckoning has not yet arrived. You step forward once more, and this time, the world around you thins into something quieter, but not calmer. The terror hasn't ended. It has simply reached a point where the machinery starts to creak under its own weight. It's late 1938 and into the early 1940s now, and though the worst of the Great Purge has passed, its echoes still rattle through the foundations of the Soviet Union. Stalin stands firmly enthroned, the population cowed, the party hollowed out, and the institutions rebuilt in his image. Yet even now, you sense the faintest shift in the air, a soft stirring of dissent, a whisper of the reckoning that will come only after his death. The mainstream historical fact marks the beginning of this shift. After Stalin's death in 1953, under Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leadership launched a process known as de-Stalinization, openly condemning elements of the purges and acknowledging the massive injustices committed. But right here, in the years leading up to that future moment, you feel the long road still ahead. Nothing is undone yet. Survivors are still in the gulag. Families are still searching for answers. The fear remains an instinct, like a muscle twitch that refuses to relax. You find yourself in a cramped office inside the Central Committee building in 1938. Lavrentiy Beria has just replaced Nikolai Yezhov as head of the NKVD. Papers are shuffled with uncharacteristic hesitation. You sense an internal political storm, the system purging the purger. Officers who once delivered arrest quotas with pride now whisper in corners. Some rush to correct past mistakes, others burn documents. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Some NKVD officers began writing panicked letters to Stalin, claiming they had overfulfilled quotas too enthusiastically and begging forgiveness. When terror becomes too big to control, it begins eating itself. You stand in a dim archival room where clerks sort through stacks of old case files. One clerk frowns at a folder and mutters to his colleague, "Another false case." His colleague shrugs. They set the folder aside. For the first time in years, there's slight hesitation in stamping accusations as truth. Only slight. Not enough to save anyone yet, but enough to signal fatigue. Historians still debate whether Stalin ever regretted the scale of the purge, or whether he viewed the casualties as inevitable collateral in the struggle to secure his reign. Some claim he slowed the terror because he felt threatened by the chaos it unleashed. Others believe he simply felt it had accomplished its purpose. But as you stand in the middle of a half-empty meeting hall, with chairs scraped back, papers strewn, and officials staring at their hands instead of at each other, you feel a simpler truth. The country could not survive much more of this. You walk into a gulag camp now, snow whipping across a frozen expanse, barracks leaning against the wind like exhausted giants. Prisoners shovel snow, chop wood, haul sledges. Some are political prisoners. Some are peasants arrested under collectivization quotas. Some are engineers or former party members condemned during the trials. A man turns his head as you pass. His beard is thick with frost. His eyes hold a distant exhaustion. He whispers to a fellow prisoner, "I confessed to protect my wife." The other man nods. He did too. You see something small, but meaningful. Prisoners marking days on walls, drawing tiny lines, whispering stories at night. Memory becomes resistance. A quirky detail here. Some prisoners secretly practiced foreign languages taught to them by other inmates, a quiet rebellion through learning. In a place designed to erase identity, people cling to knowledge like it's flame in a snowstorm. You drift back to Moscow, now in the early 1940s. The purges have ceased in their mass operations form, but the impact lingers everywhere. Empty desks, unfilled positions, people stepping into roles they were never trained for. When Germany invades in 1941, you see the Soviet military scramble, brittle in places where experienced officers once stood. Yet you also see something unexpected: resilience, adaptation, a willingness to bleed for survival. The Great Purge has weakened the state, but it hasn't broken it. History turns on these paradoxes. You move forward in time, slow, steady steps, until March 1953. Stalin dies. For a moment, the USSR seems to stop breathing. Crowds mourn. Others wait silently, wondering what happens now. You hear someone whisper, "Perhaps things will change." The whisper sounds fragile, like a match being struck in a storm. Then Khrushchev speaks. In 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, he denounces Stalin's cult of personality, condemns the purges, and names the unspeakable. Innocent people were killed. A line is crossed, publicly, irrevocably. You walk into a cramped apartment where a family listens to Khrushchev's secret speech through a smuggled transcript. The mother gasps. The father closes his eyes, tears streaming silently down his face. Their son, too young to remember the purges, watches them strangely, not understanding. Healing begins in rooms like this one, quietly, painfully, incompletely. Historians still argue how sincere Khrushchev's condemnation was, how thorough de-Stalinization truly became, how many lives were restored on paper, but never in reality. You stand between these debates, aware that truth often comes filtered, fragmentary, filtered again, like light through dusty glass. But what matters is this: the Great Purge no longer remains an unspoken terror. Its victims are acknowledged. Its machinery is exposed. The silence cracks. Now you drift outward, one last time, over cities and factories and forests, over gulag ruins and crowded apartments and schoolrooms with faded portraits removed from walls. You see the imprint the purge left on the psyche of a nation, caution embedded in speech patterns, fear woven into family stories, resilience carried in the quiet dignity of survivors. The terror is over, the memory is not, and the long shadow stretches still. Now the story begins to dim, like a lantern slowly turning low as midnight settles on a quiet room. You breathe out gently, letting the images fade. The cold hallways, the echoing boots, the whispered accusations drifting through thin apartment walls. Even though the tale is heavy, even though the weight of history presses down like winter snow, you let yourself loosen, inch by inch. You're here, safe, wrapped in the soft hush of your own space. Let the tension unwind from your shoulders. Those tense scenes aren't yours to carry. They belong to another time, another world. You simply walked through them as a visitor, and now you can step back across that threshold, leaving the echoes behind like footprints in melting snow. The lights of Moscow, the crackle of old radios, the rhythm of typewriters, they dissolve into a gentle hum, fading into something softer, calmer. Feel the pace slowing. Your breath lengthens. Your thoughts drift lightly, the way snowflakes drift sideways in a quiet breeze. Imagine yourself standing on an empty riverbank at night, the surface of the water glassy and still. Nothing moves except the tiny shimmer of moonlight as it stretches across the surface, calm and unbroken. The world feels safe in moments like this, still, patient, timeless. You can let your mind settle the way snow settles on branches, quietly, effortlessly. Whatever remains from the story, the shadows, the questions, the heavy silences, just let them float like mist and dissipate. You've traveled far tonight. Now it's time to come home to your breath, your warmth, your quiet room. And as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts soften into slow waves, feel yourself drifting gently toward rest.